The Greek city-states viewed Macedon with contempt as a rough, uncultured land of warriors and herdsmen, hardly worthy of political attention. But Philip, sharp-eyed and hungry for power, saw opportunity in chaos. From the very beginning, he wielded a double-edged sword, one side forged in iron and battlefield discipline, the other in whispers, wine, and well-timed marriages. He reformed the Macedonian phalanx, turning his infantry into a disciplined killing machine, their sarissas, spears over 20 feet long, of death. But war alone could not build a kingdom. Philip knew that loyalty born of fear fades the moment your enemies stop trembling. So he built a court that operated more like a spider's web, each strand woven through human emotion, desire, fear, ambition, jealousy. He took wives not out of love, but from every corner of Greece, Illyria, and Thrace, over 7 political marriages in total, each one securing an alliance, neutralizing a threat, or anchoring his influence deeper into rival territories. And yet, even in this cold calculus, there were sparks of real passion. His marriage to Olympias, a princess of Epirus, was one such bond. Fiery, proud, and deeply religious, Olympias believed her son Alexander was not Philip's alone, but the child of Zeus himself, sent to reshape the world. At first, Philip admired her intensity, perhaps even loved her. But over time, her pride became a threat. Her devotion to Alexander a challenge to his authority. Their relationship twisted into rivalry, then disdain, and in the shadows of this marriage, other tensions were simmering. Philip was not faithful, nor did anyone expect him to be. He took lovers openly, courtiers, servants, even boys. In ancient Macedon, sexuality was not rigidly defined, but it was always political. Pleasure was power. Control over the body was control over the will. One such favorite was a young noble named Pausanias, once the king's shield-bearer and companion in battle. Handsome, loyal, and naive, Pausanias was drawn into the court's inner circle not by force, but by a kind of gravitational pull, the dangerous intimacy that comes from standing too close to a king. But favor is fragile in a world ruled by paranoia. One night, at a royal banquet, Pausanias was passed over, replaced in Philip's affections by another younger boy. Humiliated and enraged, Pausanias lashed out, slandering his rival and accusing him of being a whore. The other boy, protected by a powerful general named Attalus, retaliated with vicious cruelty. Pausanias was ambushed, beaten, and raped, not in secret, but as a warning, a spectacle meant to break him. He appealed to Philip for justice, but the king, eager to maintain political alliances with Attalus, turned a blind eye. That betrayal, cold, personal, and absolute, was the beginning of the end. Pausanias did not forget, and he did not forgive. While Macedon celebrated the marriage of Philip's daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympian's own brother, Pausanias was a dazzling event.
Envoys from every corner of the Hellenic world gathered in Aegai, the old capital. Statues lined the parade route. Priests offered sacrifices to the gods. Philip entered the theater unarmed, radiant in purple robes, flanked by nobles. In that brief moment, he believed he had secured everything: peace with Epirus, unity in Macedon, the loyalty of the people, and the succession of his son Alexander. He stepped forward, and from the crowd Pausanias emerged. One thrust of a dagger, straight to the ribs. Philip staggered. The man who had built an empire with blood and brilliance collapsed in an instant.
Pausanias tried to flee, but he was hunted down and killed, silencing him forever, or so they thought, because that assassination didn't just end a life, it unleashed a storm. In a single stroke, Alexander, barely 20 years old, became king. Olympias, ever the schemer, orchestrated purges. Attalus was murdered. Cleopatra and her child were burned alive. Anyone who could challenge Alexander's legitimacy vanished in fire or steel. But the deeper truth behind Philip's death was buried, distorted by fear, revenge, and myth. Some whispered that Olympias herself had encouraged Pausanias, feeding his hatred to clear the way for her son. Others believed Alexander knew of the plot and chose silence, waiting for fate to do his bidding. No one can say for certain. What remains is this: the most powerful man in Macedon, perhaps in all of Greece, was undone not by a foreign enemy, but by a broken lover humiliated before the court. A man discarded after being used, a human heart turned weapon. And in that singular act of vengeance, the world shifted. Because without Philip's death, there is no Alexander the Great. No conquest of Persia, no spread of Hellenic culture, no legends carved into the bones of history. That is the terrifying power of intimacy at the heart of empire. What kings embrace in private becomes the fate of nations. Behind every war, every monument, every golden crown, there is a pulse of fragile emotion, betrayal, lust, ambition, pride. And when those emotions erupt, they leave behind not just bloodstains on marble floors, but shock waves that echo for centuries. This is not just the story of a king's assassination. It is a mirror held to our own nature, a reminder that the line between love and destruction is often written in flesh.
The aftermath of Philip's assassination was not a moment of mourning. It was a silent detonation, the kind that doesn't echo outward, but collapses inward, crushing everything beneath the weight of suspicion, grief, and uncontrollable ambition. Macedon had lost its architect, but what emerged from the rubble wasn't chaos. It was something more dangerous: clarity. The boy King Alexander stood still amid the splintered pieces of his father's legacy and chose not to rebuild, but to burn away the past entirely. And Olympias, ever the serpent coiled at the heart of Macedonian politics, slithered forward with vengeance, blooming like a poison flower. Her enemies didn't just fall, they were erased, their names blackened, their blood offered to her gods, their bones left as warnings. But even Olympias, with all her ruthless brilliance, could not have foreseen how quickly her son would transform from heir to force of nature in just 2 years. Alexander had consolidated power, stamped out rebellion, and begun dreaming on a scale no man had ever dared. Yet behind that meteoric rise were scars, deep and personal, left by a father's betrayal, a mother's manipulation, and a palace soaked in trauma. But this isn't just the story of Alexander. Not yet, because before his empire could stretch from the Nile to the Indus, we must first return to the haunted corridors of Macedon and confront the strange, brutal customs that shaped the minds of kings. For centuries, Macedonian nobility thrived on a code of honor forged in violence and sealed with wine. Royal banquets were less celebrations and more arenas of dominance. Men drank until reason vanished. Alliances were made and broken between gulps. Poisonings were not uncommon. Laughter could end in convulsions. But it was the court's rituals of masculinity that left the deepest marks. Boys were taken from their mothers young, raised in military camps where pain was a teacher and affection a weakness. To cry was shameful, to hesitate in battle unforgivable. Intimacy existed, yes, but it was transactional, layered with status, often exploitative, and always watched. One of the darkest practices was the grooming of pages. Young noble boys selected to serve the king. It was considered an honor. They learned swordsmanship, diplomacy, and the art of loyalty, but they were also subjected to the unpredictable whims of those in power. Many were used as companions, some as lovers. Consent was a concept alien to that world, and power was the only currency. These boys, like Pausanias once had been, lived at the edge of glory and degradation. Some survived to become generals, others vanished into silence. And yet, even in such a brutal culture, love existed, in secret, in glimpses. But more often, what passed for love was hunger. Hunger for status, for touch, for revenge. As Philip aged, his paranoia grew. He saw betrayal in every smile, every whisper. He began replacing old friends with newer faces, younger loyalties. Men who had fought beside him for decades found themselves cast out, their influence waning. He grew obsessed with succession, not just who would take his throne, but who would deserve it. Alexander, though brilliant and charismatic, reminded Philip too much of Olympias. Their bond had frayed. The king once mocked his son's belief that he was descended from gods, calling him a fool at a feast, drunkenly, boasting that Alexander owed everything to him. Alexander left the banquet in rage. Some say he wept. Others say he swore never to be humiliated again. That night, the seed of ambition began to twist inside him, not as a desire to rule, but as a need to surpass. Not just his father, but everyone. And what of the women? Macedonian women, especially royal ones, were not meek figures hidden in shadows. They were warriors in silk, intelligent, manipulative, terrifyingly patient. Olympias, in particular, understood that power was rarely given, so it had to be taken, drop by drop, death by death. After Philip's murder, she unleashed a campaign of retribution that can only be described as ritualistic. She ordered the killing of Philip's newest wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant daughter. They were not executed, they were displayed, stripped of nobility, reduced to warnings. Olympias didn't want them dead. She wanted them erased. It was as if she were carving out a space in history for her son, free from rivals, free from memory. But these weren't isolated acts of madness. They were ancient strategies dressed in horror. Across the ancient world, power was preserved through blood. In Persia, rivals were blinded or buried alive. In Egypt, heirs were poisoned in cradles. In Rome, entire family lines vanished overnight. Macedon was no different. Its brutality was not a flaw, it was a design. A mechanism to ensure that only the most ruthless, the most cunning, the most emotionally detached could survive. And so Alexander did survive, and more. He inherited not only an army, but a philosophy that greatness is never given, only taken. That kingship demands sacrifices, not of self, but of everyone else. Yet inside that philosophy there was always a ghost, Philip's ghost, the father he admired and hated, the man who taught him how to wield a sword but never how to trust, the man who gave him power but withheld affection, who humiliated his mother, who betrayed a lover, who fell not in battle but at a celebration, undone by a kiss turned sour. And as Alexander marched east, conquering kingdoms, burning cities, and redrawing the map of the known world, he carried Philip's legacy with him, like a wound that refused to close. There's something chilling in how history forgets the intimate causes of empire. We remember the wars, the victories, the monuments, but we forget the raped page, the scorned queen, the insult at dinner, the whispered threat. These are not footnotes. They are the blueprint. And when Alexander stood atop the ruins of Persepolis, watching the flames devour the palace of Darius, perhaps he wasn't thinking of conquest at all. Perhaps he was thinking of a wedding in AG, of a dagger drawn in the sunlight, of a man who had everything and lost it to the heart he broke. History is not written by victors, it is written by survivors. And the story of Philip II is not a story of greatness undone by enemies. It is a story of greatness undone by intimacy. The most dangerous blade is not the one drawn in war. It's the one held close, the one hidden behind a lover's eyes, a friend's smile, a child's promise. That is the legacy of Philip II, and that is the darkness Alexander inherited, a lesson burned into his bones. Trust no one, love nothing, conquer everything. They say empires are built on ambition, but few admit how often they are born from wounds. And as Alexander swept eastward across the dust of ancient kingdoms, carrying his father's blood in his veins and his mother's fire in his soul, he didn't merely conquer, he consumed. Cities fell not just to his armies, but to the weight of his presence, as if the boy bore in him the inevitability of destiny. But destiny is a myth whispered by the broken to give meaning to ruin. The truth is more intimate, more terrifying. Alexander was not led by fate, he was driven by ghosts. His father's shadow stretched across every battlefield. Every victory was a conversation with the dead. And somewhere, behind every war elephant, every siege tower, every burning temple, there was the echo of a wedding in Aegea and a body left cooling in royal robes. What followed Philip's death wasn't just a new reign, it was a fever. Alexander, barely 20, set out to unite Greece and destroy Persia. But his campaign was not simply military, it was psychological. He didn't just want submission, he wanted awe. Cities that resisted were erased. Thebes, one of Greece's greatest powers, defied him. He reduced it to rubble in days, over 6,000 dead, survivors sold into slavery. This wasn't just strategy, this was theater. Blood as spectacle, grief as message, a performance for the gods and for the future. And yet, inside Alexander still lived the boy who had once watched his father mock his mother, who had heard whispers about whether he was truly the son of Philip or a child of the heavens. That hunger to prove himself wasn't pride, it was desperation. He didn't just want to defeat Darius, king of kings, he wanted to eclipse his own lineage, to become myth. But myths require sacrifice. As his campaign dragged into the east, Alexander changed. He began adopting Persian customs, dressing in silk, demanding proskinesis, a ritual bow once reserved for gods and emperors. His Macedonian